Sailing up the wide, gray Guadalquivir River on a spring day in 1536, Hernando de Soto would have first glimpsed Seville for the first time in years, over 15 years since he had last seen Spain. For him, I'm sure it was a beautiful sight. Just 22 years earlier, he had left this city as a no-name page. Now he was returning at the age of 36, a hero. For not only was he the most important captain from Peru to return home since Hernando Pizarro a year earlier, and one of the richest, carrying 1,000 pounds of gold, he also happened to be arriving at a singular moment in Spanish history when his countrymen were triumphant. As Soto's ship slowly wound through the freshly planted fields of spring wheat, grapes, and citrus south of the city, everything seemed to be going right for the Spanish. On the throne sat an energetic, if already tired, king-emperor, who at 36 dominated Europe as no one had since Charlemagne, controlling scattered territories from Hungary to Germany to the Netherlands and Italy to Spain. In the past 5 years, his soldiers and conquistadors had humiliated his enemies, the French in Milan and Venice, the Turks at Vienna, and conquered an immense new empire in the Indies. Within a decade, Charles's luster would dim as his Machiavellian maneuverings in Europe unraveled, and he plunged into a bloody, soul-wrenching campaign against Christian reformers led by Martin Luther. But for the moment, the Spanish were exultant. Soto's friends later recalled that summer in Seville as a flurry of tournaments, gambling, and partying. In between all the games, Soto made efforts to attend to all the serious business of transitioning from one conquest to the next. All of his gold was immediately impounded by the Casa de Contratación, Spain's effective ministry of New World conquest. This was standard operating procedure in the 16th century. Men had to bribe and negotiate their money back. For Soto, this process seems to have gone smoothly. We don't know exactly how much tax Soto paid, though it seems he was forced into giving the crown a loan, amount unknown. This was also common practice in the 16th century, as Charles V was always broke. Almost immediately after arriving in Seville, Soto informed the Casa de Contratación that he intended to ask Charles for permission to carry out another conquest in the New World. Odds are the Casa was thrilled with the prospect of more taxes, not to mention the bribes. Charles himself did not arrive in Seville for almost 2 years. The two men met in 1537. Interestingly, they were nearly the exact same age. Apparently, the emperor was impressed with Soto, although we have no record of the meeting. Evidence of Soto's success with the king came on April the 20th, when Charles issued the first of 3 documents providing Soto with permission to conquer a new territory. Soto originally wanted permission to conquer what is today Colombia or Guatemala. Instead, and somewhat shockingly, Charles granted Soto permission to invade a territory about as far away in the Indies from that location as anyone thought you could get. They called it La Florida. How exactly this happened, we're not sure. However, it seems likely that Colombia and Guatemala had already been seized by other conquistadors, and they were just off the table. Soto was not the first to try to conquer North America. The Spanish crown had already launched 3 separate expeditions to seize what would become the United States. All had ended in disaster. Ponce de Leon, the Fountain of Youth guy, was the first. The most recent was Panfilo de Narváez, who was a veteran of the Cuban conquest. But that had been a decade earlier, in 1527. He landed in Tampa Bay, but disappeared without a trace in June of 1528. Soto signed his contract with the king on April 20th, 1537, after weeks of haggling over how much tax Soto would pay and whether or not he would be named governor for life. In one major concession, the king also appointed Soto the governor of Cuba, which he planned to use as a base of operations for his expedition. Now, affairs were moving on the other side of the world in a way that was going to have dramatic consequences for Hernando de Soto in the future. During the summer of 1536, about the time Soto was partying in Seville, far across the ocean sea in Mexico, Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza received a gaunt, heavily tattooed medicine man who had appeared one day to the north of the city. His name was Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, former royal treasurer of the Narváez expedition, which 8 years earlier had disappeared without a trace in La Florida. Declaring Cabeza de Vaca's survival a miracle, Mendoza provided the former treasurer with clothes and housing, and the following year, a ship to convey him back across the sea, where he arrived in Lisbon on August 9th. Journeying soon after to Valladolid, Cabeza de Vaca met with King Charles and handed him a brief report on the fate of Narváez's expedition. He also conferred with the king in private, reportedly telling him about certain secrets he told no one else. Of course, the very mention of secrets, combined with Cabeza de Vaca's claims to have seen emeralds and gold, plunged the court into a frenzy of speculation. Fresh rumors spread throughout the empire about the fantastical riches hidden deep in the interior of La Florida. For Cabeza de Vaca, however, his homecoming was not satisfying. Having returned to Spain, hoping to get Narváez's concession to La Florida, he was not pleased to find that another person had beaten him to it. For 6 years, it turned out, Cabeza de Vaca and his compatriots had wandered across the borderlands between what is today Mexico and the United States. It was during this period he developed a compassion for Native Americans that was unheard of among Spaniards during this period. It was also during this period that he began developing illusions of grandeur as to the wealth of the region. For example, turquoise that Native Americans gave him, he mistook for emeralds. Soto and others would give their lives chasing these illusions. And it's hard for me to stress just how important the timing of this all is. Just as Soto is getting ready to move out to La Florida, someone claims to have inside knowledge of all the wealth trapped within. Now, was Cabeza de Vaca correct? Of course he wasn't. There are no cities of gold and emeralds hidden within the American Southeast. But none of that mattered, because nobody knew that there was an old Mexico before Cortez stumbled upon it. Nobody knew that there was an Inca empire before Pizarro showed up. Many Europeans, and especially De Soto, very much believed that there were more hidden, wealthy empires out there for conquering. And what Cabeza de Vaca's testimony does is dumps gasoline on an already burning fire. By the fall of 1537, Soto was consumed with preparing for his expedition. This would prove to be one of the more expensive of the conquistador eras. The total price tag came in just over 130,000 castellanos, which was 6 times what the Spanish crown had spent on the most expensive expedition up to that date. Thus, Soto's expedition was, in 1537, the most expensive conquistador action ever undertaken, at least at its outset. If chroniclers are to be believed, Soto paid for it all himself out of pocket, or nearly all of it. This would have been incredibly unusual. Normally, one of the big banking houses based in or with offices in Seville fronted the cash for these expeditions, and also charged enormous interest rates. Perhaps that is what Soto sought to avoid by paying for his expedition out of pocket. By the time he was done, Soto had purchased at least 5 large ships, accompanied by several small, faster caravels designed for exploring inlets and up large rivers. Sometime during the preparations, Soto named his lieutenants. These were capable men, but crucially, they were also fiercely loyal. Soto had learned a lot watching the fallout between El Magro and Pizarro in Peru. He wanted a 100% unified chain of command, with himself undisputably at the top. Soto undoubtedly went home briefly to see his family before setting off. But we know next to nothing about the time he spent there, and it's almost certain that both of his parents were dead by then. On April 1st, 1538, Soto ordered his men to muster at Sanlúcar, a village alongside the Guadalquivir River. On Sunday, April 7th, Soto and his men heard mass, had a last feast of fresh food, and boarded their ships. Soto's armada was accompanied from Sanlúcar with another fleet of 20 large ships bound for Mexico. These were commanded by a different royal official. Soto, however, was in overall command. Interestingly enough, disaster struck from the moment this fleet left Sanlúcar. The first night out, by mistake, the other official ship actually went ahead of the flagship, which Soto was in. Now, that's a huge mistake in terms of naval operations. The ships became confused, someone thought they were under attack, and they opened fire on the ship that had overtaken the flagship. One of the masts was knocked to the ground by a cannonball. Soto, when he found out about it, was absolutely livid with the official who had allowed his ship to go out of line. In fact, he ordered him to be executed, only to calm down the next day and rescind the order. Soto and his fleet stopped at the Canary Islands to resupply in late April 1538. Nearly every fleet stopped at the Canaries during this period. Then they began to sail due west, toward Cuba. Soto's fleet took nearly twice as long as normal to cross the ocean. What people in this age still didn't totally understand was how the Gulf Stream could work as a superhighway to sort of slingshot boats across the Atlantic. His men did not sight Cuba until early 1538. As the ships drew closer, the men noted the cliffs that rim the southern shore of Cuba. If the navigator's calculations in terms of latitude and longitude were correct, and the fleet had arrived where they were supposed to, those on board should have seen a great gap in the cliffs ahead. This was the narrow channel that leads into Santiago Bay, a protected harbor first discovered by Columbus in 1492. 19 years later, it had been conquered by Diego de Velázquez, who began his rule over what had been a community of peaceful shell gatherers by enslaving them and killing most of them within months of his arrival. Entering this treacherous channel had always been nerve-wracking, particularly for a ship's pilot who had never been there before. At best, he had a crude map haphazardly marking hidden shoals. Cautiously, the pilot, Alonso Martin, would have lined up his ships, coming up slowly to a steep and rocky headland to the right of the harbor's entrance, and a lower ridge to the left where the rocky outcrops tumble into the sea. From a short distance out, he would have seen that the deepest part of the channel, where the water was the darkest, turned in a wide sweep to the right, indicating shallows to the left, where the water was a lighter shade of blue. He could not see what these shallows held, however. There was a small submerged inlet of rock, sand, and coral. Known today as Smith's Key, this hazard has wrecked many vessels over the centuries and nearly added Soto's ship to the list, thanks to a Spaniard on shore who suddenly and inexplicably waved them in the direction of the rocks. Riding a fast horse, this man deliberately signaled to the fleet to bear left, a command that certainly confused Alonso Martin, who saw the deep water of the channel moving to the right. Nonetheless, he obeyed the signal from the shore, ordering the flagship to come hard to port. This brought an 800-ton vessel swinging slowly around and headed it directly for deadly Smith's Key. At this point, the man on shore abruptly changed his mind. Even more frantically, he now signaled for the ships to turn hard to starboard. One of the men on board Gardalasco, who is the one who tells us this story, adds the following, quote, "To make himself better understood, he dismounted and ran to his right, making signs with his arms and his cape, and saying, 'Turn to the other side, you will all be lost.' Those on the flagship, when they understood him, turned as rapidly as possible to the left, but as hard as they tried, they could not prevent the ship from striking against a rock." End quote. The other ships of the fleet turned safely away, but the San Cristobal scraped bottom, quote, "striking so hard against a rock that all on board thought it was stove in and lost," end quote. Fearing that the hull was taking on water, many aboard the San Cristobal panicked and hastily grabbed the ship's skiffs to escape. Because there was no protocol of women and children first in the 16th century, the strongest and the quickest scrambled to make room for themselves. Though Soto, who had brought his wife and her young lady in waiting, made sure that they got safely aboard one of the lifeboats. Fortunately, at this point, sailors searching below decks came running up to tell Soto that there was no structural damage to the ship, and then the liquid sloshing around in the hold was from wine from broken casks, not seawater. But what had gone wrong here? Well, the townspeople of Santiago, the harbor that they were sailing into, were horrified when they learned that they had nearly shipwrecked their new governor. But they were merely acting out of caution. A group of French pirates had been raiding in the region, and the people mistakenly thought Soto's fleet was a part of that band. Soto then presented his credentials to the city council, which immediately accepted him as governor. Soto wanted to try to woo as many young men to joining his expedition as possible. He also started buying up huge quantities of cattle, farms, food, and manufactured goods. This might sound like a good thing, but it actually wasn't, at least as far as the people of Cuba were concerned. Cuba was very much still a growing colony. It needed its farms and cattle to continue to survive. As far as many on the island were concerned, Soto was leeching away an already existing colony in the hope of building a new one somewhere else. And where was the sense in that? Soto remained in Santiago for about 4 months. Now, 20 years before, Santiago had been a major city. But since the conquest of Mexico and Peru, it had devolved into a backwater. Soto really wanted to get moving to La Florida. But Soto could not entirely neglect local crises, especially because he was the governor. Most pressing was the situation with the French. Their king, Francis I, as we all know, remained Charles's mortal enemy, as their struggle for domination in Europe spilled over into the Americas, where pirates could stage random attacks almost with impunity. Clearly, the days were over when every ship in the Caribbean was Spanish and friendly, and no seaward defenses were necessary. The Council of the Indies had discussed this very issue with Soto before he left, ordering him to build a stone fort in Havana to protect the gold fleets carrying crown taxes from Mexico to Spain. Shortly after touching down in Santiago, Soto received word that the pirates chased away from Santiago in April had just attacked Havana and burned it to the ground. A distressing development, if true, since Soto intended to use Havana as his base to explore La Florida. After one of his aides confirmed the attack, Soto sent another with some men by sail to rebuild the city of Havana. Also in Santiago, Soto launched an effort to build the stone fortresses as required by the Council of the Indies. In addition, Soto had to deal with what could be described as an uprising of Indians on the western portion of the island. Certainly, the locals appreciated all these efforts, the forts and the dealing with the uprising. But Soto's other legal decisions infuriated them. He forbade trade with the outside world. And I have to say, I really don't know why. I have looked in 10 to 15 other books to see if there's some rationale as to why he would forbade Cuba from trading with anyone, even other Spanish colonies. And I just don't see one. Regardless, the decision absolutely crippled Cuba's economy, which was based on trade with Mexico. Plus, he forbade the importation of slaves, even as encomienda owners were desperate for new sources of labor. Certainly, the vecinos of Cuba were grateful for Soto, who was at least trying to cope with the problems that beset Cuba at this moment. But everything else he did made them furious, absolutely furious. Sometime before departing Santiago for Havana, Soto dispatched his Major General, Alonso de Ayala, on a long-neglected mission to Peru, informing his partner, Hernan Ponce de Leon, about everything that had transpired since they parted 3 years earlier in Peru. Soto had more on his mind, though, than a simple, up-to-date report. He instructed Ayala to ask Ponce for an additional 10,000 ducats, desperately needed to finance the expedition's final phase. A bold request, considering Soto hadn't communicated for over a year with his partner. He instructed Ayala to tell Ponce that as far as he was concerned, the company and the Pact of Brotherhood still existed, and that he would equally divide all plunder and wealth gained in La Florida with his old comrade, provided, of course, Ponce sent him this money. Ayala set sail that summer, but he only got as far as Panama. Here he was told Ponce had already left Peru, that he would be arriving any day in Panama on his way to Spain, having cashed out the company's properties. While waiting for Ponce in Panama City, Ayala took care of another business item for Soto, selling all the property bequeathed to him by his wife as a dowry. Ayala later recalled he sold what was actually Pedro de Vila's old ranch, which must have brought in a lot of money and also, I'm not going to lie, probably a little bit of self-satisfaction for Hernando de Soto. Somehow, however, despite the fact that there was only one town, Ayala managed to miss Ponce de Leon as he was traveling through the isthmus. Later on, he would insist that this happened because he was sick, though it's hard to believe that in this one colony, Ponce slipped by Soto's servant undetected, but still he did. Either way, Ayala was either really, really sick, or more likely Ponce purposely avoided him. For Soto's old partner, he was ready to just go back to Spain. He wanted to just cash in his chips. He didn't want any more frontier life. He didn't want the money from La Florida. He figured he had enough money from Peru. I mean, this is the one rare guy who actually just cashes out at the gambling table at the New World. Now, of course, this was, also super convenient for Ponce, because he was taking back to Spain 60 to 100,000 pesos worth of gold and silver that he got from selling off the company's properties in Peru, half of which, according to the contract, should go to Hernando de Soto. So his reasons for eluding Ayala in Panama probably had a lot less to do with a desire not to go on this expedition to La Florida, and a lot more to do with the fact that he didn't want to give Soto his half. Back in Cuba, early that fall, Soto mustered his army. Most of it would sail around to the northern coast of Cuba, where all would depart for La Florida. Soto, with 150 cavalry, would go overland so he could take stock of the province he would never see again. Cuba, even up to this point, had never been heavily populated. And the land that Soto now marched through to Havana was mostly swamps and grassland. It wasn't the most fun trek in the history of the world, but frankly, it was a good taste of things to come. Eventually, Soto reached Havana, where the fleet was waiting for him. But then he got some bad news. It seems that an expedition from Mexico, led by Francisco de Coronado, was marching north to explore what is today the American Southwest. Soto, however, thought that this was 100% part of La Florida. He was furious, according to one report, quote, not knowing where Coronado was going. The governor, and he's talking about Soto, began fearing that the two might encounter and hinder one another, and that trouble might arise between them, as had happened in Peru between Pizarro and Almagro, and in Central America during the Wars of the Captains, end quote. Given what Soto had lived through already, I honestly cannot say that I blame him for feeling the way that he did. It seemed like the only way that the Spanish could lose in the New World was when they ran into each other. Every native civilization that they had encountered, every First Nations empire, had simply been unable to stand up to that deadly combination of smallpox, armor, and horses. The only thing that could derail an expedition was another expedition. So Soto stepped on the gas. Sometime in late 1538, he ordered one of his lieutenants to find a suitable landing spot in La Florida for his expeditionary force. The man was an accomplished geographer and navigator, so he skipped all the marshy ground on Florida's southern shore and went instead to the more hospitable Gulf. Eventually, he picked a landing spot which most historians agree was Tampa Bay. As an aside, by the way, there is this whole cottage industry that I never knew existed amongst historians when it comes to recreating Soto's North American trek. No one, and I do mean no one, agrees on every spot. But I'm going to do my best to give you the consensus in terms of generally where he is and when. And we're talking about a trek here, that's 5-6 years long, so it's not huge, but he manages to cover quite a large swath of territory in that time. When the ships returned, Soto was delighted to learn that not only was there an excellent landing spot, but there was, evidently, much gold in Florida as well. This the advance team had apparently learned from conversing with natives. The final count for the expedition was about 600 officers, soldiers, tradesmen, servants, and non-Indian slaves. They also took around 240 horses. So in terms of men, Soto had about 3.5 times what Pizarro had when he conquered Peru. He also had 5 large ships, 2 caravels, and 2 small brigantines. Finally, on the 18th of May, 1539, the expedition to conquer La Florida set out. Soto's fleet first sighted the shoreline of La Florida on May the 25th, 1539. Immediately, lookouts began scanning the coastline, looking for a broad, natural harbor. What they found was an inlet Soto called Bahia de Espiritu Santo. Most historians agree that today is Tampa Bay. Where exactly Soto's boot first met American soil, however, remains a matter of conjecture and hot debate. When they got closer to the shore, Soto dispatched a brigantine and scouting party that he would personally lead to find a campsite. At this point, the fleet probably stood at anchor near a thin coastal island in Tampa Bay, which today is called Longboat Key. Soto led his brigantine out ideally to find natives with whom they could confirm the existence of gold, ideally nearby. They didn't find any. In fact, they got lost. Soon, De Soto found himself with the sun dropping fast below the horizon. Not wanting to get caught away from the fleet after dark, Soto ordered the rowers to return to the ships. But when they emerged from the narrow passage between the two islands, they found that the wind had shifted direction and stiffened to a light gale that nearly prevented them from paddling out into the open sea. Once free of the inlet, the tiny craft could make no headway toward the fleet as the wind pushed them repeatedly back against the beach in Longboat Key. Finally, as the sun dropped into the sea and the sky darkened into twilight, the governor gave up and ordered his men to run the brigantine onto the beach for the night in a protected spot out of the driving wind. This could have either been potentially Longboat Key or possibly back inside Sarasota Bay. We're not sure. Wherever it was, one of the men on board named Rodrigo Rangel says that they found a small Indian village hastily abandoned, containing, quote, a hut like the large ones that had been seen in the Indies, and several smaller ones, end quote. Soto was now with his small group stranded on shore miles away from his fleet. Oviedo, one of Soto's key lieutenants back with the ships, noted that he was very lucky, Soto that is, that the natives didn't wipe out his scouting party then and there. Luckily, the next morning, the fleet spotted Soto's brigantine, and they were able to send the caravel to collect the men. For 4 more days, the fleet proceeded slowly into the bay. On May the 30th, Soto found a suitable enough landing space that he ordered the horses unloaded. Assuming he followed normal conquistador procedures, Soto then likely cleared out enough space for a campsite, cleaning the underbrush and felling several trees. During this process, Soto's men first encountered a group of hostile natives. The meeting didn't go well. 2 natives were killed, and 2 horses were wounded, and no one found any gold. Not the best start. The following morning, Soto took 100 or more men in brigantines to find a more suitable campsite. He found it 8 miles to the north in an abandoned Indian village called Osita. Soto decided to make this his temporary headquarters and ordered his men to march there at once. Everyone, including the stragglers, reached Osita by June the 3rd, muddy, hot, and happy to find abandoned huts to rest in. But the bad news was that this seemed like an extremely primitive village. Not only was there no sight of golden pyramids or golden temples or golden anything, these locals didn't even seem to grow corn, a crop with which the Spaniards now associated with advanced Mesoamerican cultures. Soto, of course, remained undaunted. The question then, of course, is, when Hernando de Soto planted the purple and gold standard of Castile and Aragon on the Florida coast, what exactly was he claiming? Because he did that. According to the king, the governor combined the concessions given to Panfilo Narvaez and Lucas de Ayllon. Theoretically, this encompassed the entire of North America above Mexico, all 7.3 million square miles of it. Quite a piece of real estate to be claimed by one person standing on a beach who had no real idea of the continent's size. But then again, such is the age of the conquistador. Still, even if De Soto had known the audacious claim he was putting forth, I doubt it would have stopped him. Nor was Soto alone. As he offloaded his men and material late that May, Near the Indian village of Osita, other explorers were making their own bids to penetrate deep into the interior. In Mexico, Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was about to launch his invasion of what was now the southwestern United States. And far away to the northeast, in the St. Lawrence River Valley, the French explorer Jacques Cartier, 2 years later, would begin his third and final expedition, trekking deep into Canada, where he had already claimed the homelands that belonged to the Huron, the Algonquin, and the Iroquois, all for France, without ever asking them. Meanwhile, to the west, a man named Francisco de Ayala and later Juan Rodrigo Cabrillo were exploring the Pacific coast from Mexico, which would eventually take Cabrillo as far north as present-day Oregon. It was an age when one had to just point and say mine. In 1539, though Columbus's first voyage was then 47 years old, Europeans knew next to nothing about North America. It may come as a surprise to some of you listening, but all the attention had been in the Caribbean, Central and South America. What would become the United States and Canada was largely an afterthought. That's going to change when England becomes more of a colonial player in the 17th century, but even Jamestown won't be founded until 1607. Soto was in uncharted lands. Already he and his men had met and killed several of the local peoples, the Timucuan Indians, a people who inhabited the upper half of the Florida Peninsula. Soto actually didn't want to kill these people. He hoped to capture a few to interrogate them. Again, he wanted to know where all the kingdoms of gold were. Soto's early frustration at being unable to capture knowledgeable Indians, or any Indians for that matter, other than a few stragglers, became a major problem as summer proceeded, and the natives continued to elude his men. In part, this was because of the inexperienced Spaniards had not yet properly learned about how to sneak through the swamps and forests. But even when Soto's men managed to find Indians, they proved to be among the most formidable fighters Soto had ever seen, including the Incas. Their secret weapon was something that was unheard of anywhere else in the Indies: the longbow. Indeed, Soto had not faced such deadly bows and arrows since his late teens in Colombia. The Florida natives used what was kind of a massive bow that was 6 or 7 feet long. There was no poison, but their deadly accuracy was almost perfect, even from as far away as 200 paces. Soto's men had great difficulty even bending these bows that were as tall as a man. According to one, the arrows were, quote, very heavy and so tough that a sharpened cane passed through a shield. Some were pointed like a fishbone, some as sharp as an awl, and others with a certain stone like a diamond point. Generally, when these strike against armor, they go right through the links, end quote. So Soto was up against it in terms of the odds, and frankly was probably a little bit surprised by the sophistication of the weaponry that was being used by the natives, despite the fact that they didn't seem to evidence any other characteristics of advanced Mesoamerican civilizations. During these first busy weeks in La Florida, Soto sent his scouts out in all directions in the hopes of finding evidence of an advanced civilization. He also organized his army into permanent squadrons, 4 cavalry and 2 infantry. For around 60 days, the camp remained a flurry of activity as men unloaded the ships and built palisades of earth and timber. As Soto organized the army, his men debated whether or not their governor should build a permanent settlement. Soto, who usually let his men openly talk over such matters before making his final decision, cut off these discussions in mid-July. He told them that there would be no colony here because the soil was too swampy and too sterile. He did not dismiss the idea of an inland settlement, however. Now, according to a couple of sources, the nearby native chiefs knew that the Spaniards were coming, and they sent out a party of 30 men to greet them, some 60 to 80 miles from their main town, which is called Osita, west of present-day Orlando. Carrying gifts of maize and fur, they brought a titillating message from their ruler that up north in a place called Ocale, the Spaniards would find all the treasure they could carry. The scouts told Soto's men, quote, that land, talking about Ocale, had gold in abundance, so much so that when they came to make war on the people of Ocale, they wore hats of gold resembling helmets, end quote. Now, to an extent, was any of this true? No. And quite frankly, did these Native Americans believe any of this? No. They just shrewdly understood what the Spaniards wanted and were willing to give them the information that would take them somewhere else, anywhere other than here. And not for the last time, I'm going to bring up Soto's biggest mistake, failing to build a settlement on the coast. Soto spent his entire time in North America trying to find a civilization to loot and plunder. He never put down any roots. Had he would have been able to resupply and reconnoiter more effectively and more permanently. But he didn't. Before departing Tampa Bay, Soto ordered one of his men to stay with 40 others to guard the harbor and the remaining ships of the fleet, and keep open communication lines between Florida and Havana. This was on the 9th of July. At this point, the mood of Soto and everyone else in the expedition remained high. At the end of a letter that he wrote around the same time, Soto concludes, quote, may it please God that this may be so, for of what these Indians say I believe nothing, but I will see and must see, although they know and have it for a saying that if they lie to me it will cost them their lives. But further on, we will find much treasure, end quote. Now from his vantage point, high on top of Osita's mound, Hernando de Soto had an excellent view of his army preparing to leave this ground to march north to Ocale. This is on July the 15th, 1539. Later that morning, Soto probably took a final look on the mound, watching with great satisfaction as his men formed into neat lines and their units set off briskly to scout and secure the road to the interior. The army departed Osita, arrayed in standard conquista marching order, beginning as always with the vanguard. Behind them came the main army, called the battle line. Divided into squadrons, some of these men would have been on alert in case of attack. Others protected the senior officers. Still others protected the porters, slaves, prisoners, and non-combatants, snaking along the trail in a procession that sometimes stretched for several miles. Typically, Soto rode at the head of this large, ungainly center. Throughout July, Soto and his army continued moving north through Florida. It would have been, frankly, absolutely miserable. The land was all swamps and marshes. There were constant hit-and-run attacks from Native Americans who were always shadowing his army, though Soto and his men likely could not see them much of the time. On July the 24th, Soto reached what is today probably Withlacoochee Swamp. It's a 12-mile-long depression of stagnant bogs and freshwater lakes just outside Orlando. Soto's biggest problem now was not a lack of gold, there was clearly none of that in Central Florida, but a lack of food. Soto tended to move quickly with an advance force, while the bulk of his slower-moving army followed. Captured native porters, suffering under heavy burdens and from a lack of nutrition, dropped dead in their tracks, in droves. Still, Soto pressed on as the desperate men followed him, hoping for word that they had found food. Right now, they were trying to reach the town of Ocale, which Soto had been told possessed a bounty of food supplies. The only problem was, he didn't know exactly where Ocale was. His men had no choice but to continue marching, mud and muck up to their knees, pestered endlessly by mosquitoes, and haunted by the distant and eerie calls of wolves, alligators, and birds. The army ultimately did reach Ocale, but in what was going to be a preview of probably everything to come from here on out, it was not the oasis Soto thought it would be. Ocale turned out to be little more than a village, or another several villages put together. Probably no more than a few dozen palm-thatched huts. There were no great stores of food. There was no gold. But there was enough for the army to avoid the ever-present specter of starvation. After the last stragglers arrived in Ocala, the Spaniards wearily gathered corn, squash, pumpkins, and beans, plundering the Indians' fields. Because they had even fewer servants left alive after the march through the swamp, most were forced to prepare their own food. While his men ate and regained their strength, Soto wondered about his situation, dismayed to find himself already 2 months into his expedition, with several men and horses killed and nothing to show for it. But this hardly dampened the enthusiasm of a man who had survived grueling marches from Darien to the Andes, who had remained convinced that these past 8 weeks were merely the prelude to a successful quest. Continuing to dream, Soto's next would-be El Dorado was a kingdom to the north called Appalachia. This time, the goal was never gold. Soto knew there was no gold there. His only hope now was to find enough food to get his men through the winter. They would worry about the gold later on. On August the 11th, he departed Ocala for this new mythical land of plenty. He had no guides, but Soto knew Appalachia lay somewhere to the north. So north he would go. For once, the pass was easy to follow. Soto was able to use what was effectively an ancient highway, cleared so well that 3 or 4 people could walk abreast. This helped the men make good time and encouraged Soto to believe that this time he was going somewhere more sophisticated. 4 days later, the army marched through what are today the outskirts of Gainesville, Florida. By now, the countryside had shifted from swamps to dry grassland and forest. Food was much more plentiful, and the men began to recover some of their lost strength. On August the 16th, they crossed the Santa Fe River about 20 miles north of Gainesville. And here, Soto's trek nearly came to an end, at least for him. They came upon a local group of Indians, whose chief devised a trick. They would pretend to be friends, surround Soto and his men, and then quickly launch a surprise attack. The Indians made the first move, one man telling us that no sooner had Soto arrived, quote, and the conversation was beginning, when he saw himself immediately surrounded by Indians, end quote. But having anticipated this attack, and someone actually told him about it, a traitor, Soto gave the signal to trigger a full-scale Spanish charge, which was one blast on a trumpet. Soto's cavalry came rushing across the field, smashing into the surrounding Indians, taking them completely by surprise. They fled towards 2 ponds on the end of the plain, but the Spanish were not about to let them escape. After surrounding the pond and waiting out several days, several Indian soldiers eventually emerged from the cool black water. The Spaniards bound them up with rope and marched them back to Soto's camp. Once in town, Soto ordered them put in chains and imprisoned in a huge lodge house in the village. As the sun rose, another eyewitness tells us that these Indians, quote, were allotted among the Christians for their service, end quote, with individual prisoners being let off in ropes and chains to the personal areas of the soldiers, where they were put to work, grinding corn, carrying equipment, fetching grass for the horses, and obeying whatever commands were given to them. Soto was used to Native Americans who had been crushed this decisively in battle being docile and dejected. But here's where he would get a lesson in difference. No sooner had the first chief been released from his chains later on that he turned on Soto and punched him in the mouth, delivering, quote, such a great blow that it bathed Soto's teeth in blood and made him spit out more blood, end quote. This, of course, was entirely suicidal, but it didn't matter. The immediate revolt seemed to engulf all the warriors, even those still in ropes and chains. They tried to grab whatever they could to use as weapons. One man apparently snatching, quote, the pestle for crushing maize, which he used with all his might to try to kill his master, end quote. Others grabbed swords and lances, much more useful for this purpose, carelessly left about. But the outcome was never in doubt. Soto's Spaniards rallied against the prisoners, who were still mostly unarmed and chained, or otherwise encumbered. Within minutes, the conquistadors had grabbed weapons and were battling back, cutting down the most recalcitrant warriors and recapturing others. This time, the prisoners were not going to be spared. Bloodied and furious, Soto ordered most of the survivors executed. Though to many, that was a mistake. Soto was, after all, desperate for labor, and he really could have used the servants. Perhaps killing a few as an example would have been a more appropriate and measured response. In fact, some of Soto's own men wrote in their diaries, considering the punishment excessive and wasteful and criticizing their commander. It wouldn't be the first time they would do so. After the massacre, Soto had no choice but to keep moving. By late September, he reached roughly what is today Tallahassee, Florida. Here things were much nicer. The pine forests of North Florida are pleasant in late September. The humidity eases off, and the temperature becomes tolerable, even for men wrapped in thick quilted armor, chainmail, and metal jackets. Yet Hernando de Soto was clearly on edge, as his guides became gradually more and more terrified approaching the Appalachee border. Go back, they pleaded, regaling their interpreter with gruesome stories about legendary Appalachee atrocities and the fierce maniacal bravery of warriors feared for hundreds of miles beyond their domain. For some Spaniards, the terror among their guides undoubtedly whetted their appetite for a good fight. Others were less enthusiastic about facing an even more formidable foe. There was also continued muttering among the men about the fate of Panfilio de Narvaez's army at the hands of the Appalachee a dozen years earlier, an incident that resulted in that entire expedition being wiped out. Soto's preoccupation with the coming campaign and the high stake he had in winning it seems to have made him more irritable than usual. An infantryman named Alvaro de Candena found out the day the army departed, sneaking away from his unit without permission to fetch a sword that he left behind. His absence was noted and reported to Soto. But instead of exacting the usual fine, demotion, or flogging for the breach of military discipline, a tense Soto ordered the young man hung. The sentence stunned the army. Soto soon calmed down and canceled the execution. Regardless, there are no further reports of swords being left behind. By now, the Appalachee knew the Spaniards were coming. Already, the Appalachee dispatched a large force of warriors to stop the advancing Spaniards. Their plan was to use a series of hit-and-run attacks, and if that failed, simple slash and burn. They would eliminate the food supply and thereby stop the Spanish dead in their tracks. These guys knew what they were doing, by the way. It would not be until the British and Creek, working in tandem, eliminated them in the early 18th century. The proud Indians Soto was about to confront were the first true Mississippians along the Spaniards' route. That is, the first highly organized kingdom with a strong central authority, standing army, elite classes of politicians, priests, and warriors, and a complex network of trade with other Mississippian kingdoms as far north as the Great Lakes, and perhaps as far south as Tenochtitlan in Mexico. At the time that Soto arrived, the Appalachee king ruled a prosperous kingdom that worshipped the sun, grew an abundance of corn, and built large cities filled with pyramids in what is today modern Leon County in Florida. In 1539, this country was fertile enough to feed some 25,000 Appalachee and possibly as many as 100,000, by far and away the most dense population that Soto had yet come across. On October the 1st, Soto officially crossed into what might be called Appalachee country on the east side of the Yasilla River, which flows through Georgia and parts of North Florida. According to one source, the Indians began their attack as soon as Soto's vanguard, quote, ventured a few steps into the swamps and thickets, end quote. The same man continues, quote, there was a lively combat. A path the Indians had made was so narrow that two men could scarcely get through it and were attacked the whole way, end quote. Now, Actually, in this particular instance, the Appalachi were sort of Greek-like at Thermopylae, able to find a bottleneck in the woods and wouldn't allow the Spaniards to get past. Soto became infuriated. He joined the combat, but even his martial prowess couldn't push back the Appalachi on this occasion. The battle became, quote, cruel and bloody, as the Spaniards pushed hard into the waist-high water, slashing and lancing and firing their guns, headed inexorably toward their target, the main channel of the river, end quote. Eventually, Soto and his men do manage to reach it by the end of the night, but both sides suffered many deaths and wounds. With night falling, Soto ordered his men to stand fast and pitch a makeshift camp. He then ordered another subordinate to build a bridge across the deep channel of the water. In describing the battle, another witness tells another colorful story, ripe with kind of romance and drama. But as usual, a lot of these stories don't jive with what we know about the actual battle. And frankly, according to yet a third witness, this battle was actually no more than a small skirmish. The Appalachians stuck to the plan, retreating, burning their villages and fields, and launching harassing attacks against Soto and his men. It was a grueling march. On October the 6th, Soto reached the Appalachian capital of Anahayika, which the natives had not burned. This is actually the only point in all of Soto's 4,000-mile march that we can say we know exactly where he is. That's because that Anahayika was in downtown Tallahassee, about a half a mile from the Florida State Capitol building. Recognizing that he could go no further before winter set in, Soto decided to fortify the town and use the stores of food left to get through the winter. Then he would continue to search for his city of gold, increasingly becoming an obsession. Hernando de Soto left Anahayika on March the 3rd, 1540. Certainly, the decision was a mistake. Soto missed an opportunity to found a new colony. Had he done so, he might have established a base from which he could launch later expeditions. But his head remained full of illusions of grandeur and gold. For the moment, his men continued to share in these fantasies, and so departed with great fanfare, convinced they were all merely steps from finding temples of gold. It did not take long for the army to reach Georgia. From there, they moved essentially due north toward the foothills of the Appalachian Mountains. Here the days and nights became a bit repetitious. They marched. Sometimes they came upon an Indian settlement. Sometimes it was occupied. More often it was abandoned. Occasionally the army was attacked by different bands of warriors who emerged from the woods or swamps and then quickly retreated back from whence they came. On March the 23rd, 1540, Soto reached Toaya, the capital of one of the 4 advanced civilizations his army would march through in Georgia. Soto stayed in Toaya only a few hours. He suddenly became obsessed once again with wanting to keep moving, inspired by the sophistication relativist of the Toaya people. According to one source, quote, "It was a constantly observed custom of his," Soto's, "that he must go himself to any new discovery of provinces, because he was not satisfied with the reports of others, but wished to see it with his own eyes," end quote. They next reached the kingdom of the Achizi. While they found some advanced farming techniques, there was no evidence of Inca-style grandeur. Soto only tarried a day. From Achizi, Soto continued following the various rivers of central Georgia as his army moved north. On May the 1st, Soto crossed into what is today South Carolina. There, he entered the kingdom of the, this is a very difficult word for me, Cofichakiti. This was probably the most sophisticated civilization Soto and his men had seen thus far. For one fleeting moment, it seemed like it might all pay off. The queen of the Cofichakiti arrived to meet them, wearing a string of precious pearls. Here was finally evidence of a luxury good Soto could do something with. Plus, the homes and the clothing of the people here were just much more elaborate in general. Unfortunately for Soto, if there had been grandeur, it was gone. the Cofichiquiti had just been decimated by plague. It's unlikely that the queen even ruled over half of the territory she and her progeny had once. One of our historians tells us that the queen herself first told Soto of the plague when they met at the river. She apologized for the lack of food on hand and told him that, quote, the pestilence of the year before had deprived her of the provisions she might have given Soto in previous years, end quote. She was able to give him enough corn for his immediate needs, though food supplies in the capital region were minimal enough that as soon as the men had regained their strength, they continued northeast towards a vassal city. This, which was called Ilapi, was probably located near present-day Chiraw in South Carolina, about 55 miles further north. There, the queen said that she had several large stores of food, which was true. But Soto continued to pester the queen and the people. Where were the gold? Where was all the precious metals? Unfortunately, at least for Soto, there weren't any, and the pearls turned out to be the only piece of evidence that we have of Cofichiquiti wealth and power. Everyone in the army was now just kind of feeling defeated, let down by the meager treasure in Cofichiquiti. I mean, it was hard for everybody to make their fortune on one string of pearls. As Soto's men rested and regained their strength, however, they began talking amongst themselves about how appropriate this place would be to establish a colony. According to one man, quote, all the men were of the opinion that they should settle that land as it was an excellent region, end quote. He was actually dead on. Agriculturally, this region of the United States today is great. But strategically, and again, what Europeans still didn't totally know was that right here, along the coast of South Carolina, would be a perfect place for a port. The Gulf Stream pushes ships north as they travel up from the Caribbean, and they'll need a place to resupply. If Soto would have recognized that, his whole expedition may have actually been a success. But Hernando de Soto had no interest in the tedious process of building colonies. He insisted to keep going, both because this region was low on food and because he was nervous about meeting up with his fleet, which he'd left back in Florida. None of this was really true, though. Soto simply just didn't want to stop in a place with no gold and a small population of potential laborers and slaves. Indeed, when he heard that 12 days inland there lived a great king ruling a country called Chiaja, he refused to listen to talk about any more staying in Cofichiquiti lands. While the men went along, some were starting to wonder if Don Hernando de Soto, the governor of La Florida, the member of the Order of Santiago, the hero of Peru, some began to wonder if he was losing his mind. So it was that on May the 12th or 13th, Soto spurred his horse and turned his back forever on probably his best chance for success in North America. Once again, his obsession with finding piles of gold so impacted Soto's decision-making that he failed to see the opportunity right there in front of him. To an extent, Hernando de Soto is a cautionary tale. He is not unlike Macbeth or any other tragic figure from Shakespeare. He had huge dreams that he simply could not let go of. In the end, they killed him. From North Carolina, Soto turned his army due west and began the march to Tennessee. The Spaniards in this area associated mountains with gold and other precious metals, so the sight of the looming Appalachian Mountains meant more to Soto than their sheer beauty. Of course, there's irony in all this talk and rumors of precious metals. For the truth is that there was, and still is, a small amount of naturally occurring gold in this region, recovered mostly by panning in creeks and streams. First discovered in 1820 by a Carolina farmer, mines in North Georgia, the Carolinas, and eastern Tennessee produced as much as $1 million a year worth of gold until 1848, when the miners literally pulled up stakes and rushed off to California. Soto failed to locate copper deposits that still exist in the area, some of which were worked by prehistoric Mississippians. In late May, Soto reached the French Broad River, which runs through Asheville, North Carolina. He was moving quickly now, his army running out of supplies. Here's a journal from one of Soto's men that gives you a good sense of what the day-to-day going was like. Quote, Friday, May 28th, we spent the night in an oak grove. Saturday, May 29th, we marched alongside a large creek, which we crossed many times. Sunday, May 30th. In the morning, messengers came in peace, and we arrived early in Gulassi, and the Indians gave us many tamales, many little dogs and corns. And because this was a good resting place, the soldiers afterwards called the term House of Gulassi when they threw the dice for good luck. May 31st, Monday. Soto left for Gulassi and took the army to an oak grove alongside the river. Tuesday, June the 1st. We passed through Conestoga and spent the night in the open. Wednesday, June the 2nd. We spent the night alongside a swamp, and we ate a great number of mulberries. Thursday, June the 3rd. We followed a large creek next to the river, the French Broad River. We'd crossed in the savannah, where the cicada went away, and now it was large. Friday, June the 4th. We went to a pine forest and a creek, where the Indians from Chiaja came in peace and brought corn. Saturday, June the 5th. In the morning, we crossed the very broad river, across a branch of it, and entered Chiaja, which is an island on the same river. End quote. This island capital is near present-day Dandridge, Tennessee. It had no gold, but it did have plentiful supplies of food, and the army, as a result, rested there for 22 days. Refreshed after their respite in Chiaja, Soto's men on June the 28th, 1540, plunged back into their journey, the full army traveling together for the first time since they crossed into the wilderness at the Savannah River. For 18 days, the Spaniards trekked roughly 150 miles across low mountain passes and downriver valleys, their path alternating from wide highways to narrow trails. Now numbering some 550 men, plus hundreds of porters, slaves, and servants, the army moved either single file or 2 or 3 men abreast, depending upon the terrain. Their goal was now to head for the heartland of the next major Mississippi empire, the Coosa. During this summer march, which would eventually take the army beyond Coosa toward the planned rendezvous with Soto's fleet on the coast of Alabama, Soto finally established a marching rhythm he had been after since making landfall in La Florida. This involved the usual conquistador method of quickly bringing local chiefs under his power so the Spaniards could use his authority to demand food, lodging, porters, and women until Soto had passed through this kingdom and on to the next, where the process would begin again in very much a leech-like manner. Soto's smooth and largely uneventful progression across the southern Appalachians was hardly a coincidence. He chose this route specifically because he had been told that the army would find the stores of food that they needed and large numbers of Indians to impress into servants. The Indians, too, were continuing to operate under the tactic of giving Soto and the invaders whatever they asked for in order to get rid of them. None of the native leaders, however, fully appreciated how much luck contributed to their design. If Soto had found any sign of treasure at all among the natives of Tennessee and Georgia, this march would have instantly ceased to be benign, with Soto grabbing whatever he wanted, whether or not the natives cooperated. Soto seems relaxed during this period. His plan to march south and link up with his fleet seemed more feasible than ever. It was late June, so he had plenty of time. As a result, he stopped his army frequently, affording the men an opportunity to rest and recuperate. Soto had 3 years left on his royal contract. He must have felt like that was plenty of time to find what he was searching for. He had mapped out a rough idea of La Florida. He could always now come back with more men later and continue the expedition. Soto's march to Cusco was not entirely without difficulty. In Casti, the next major kingdom of the Chiaja, Soto saw his peaceful sojourn nearly turn violent when he and 8 Spaniards entered the capital, probably situated 28 miles southwest of modern Knoxville, Tennessee. Looking for corn, some of his party began plundering all kinds of different storehouses near the chief's palace. This was despite a friendly welcome from the Indians, with no regard for the fact that the group was vastly outnumbered and lightly armed, and that the main army was in a camp about a half a mile away. This outrageous behavior angered the people, who seized the looters and began to quote-unquote beat them while others grabbed their bows and arrows to come forth to the plaza, end quote. Normally, Soto would have met such an assault against his own men with deadly force, if only to drive home the point that Indians who dared to lay hands on a European faced automatic punishment, even if the European was at fault. But because Soto had, quote, entered in the town carelessly and unarmed, end quote, he abruptly found himself in a position where he was likely to be the one penalized or even killed. He first heard about the fight between his men and the Indians when several natives breathlessly rushed up to the leader, that is the native leader, to report that the Spaniards were trying to plunder the royal storehouses. They were quickly followed by the bloodied Spaniards themselves, who ran up to join Soto's army. Angrily turning to his guest, the king demanded, the Native American king, an explanation as to what the native soldiers were doing. A conquistador with less experience might have panicked or attacked in a suicidal charge, and it would have been suicide in this case. Soto did neither. Instead, he proved once more the nimbleness of mind during a life-threatening crisis had been a hallmark of his success in the New World. As the Indians closed in, he suddenly turned on his own men and began to quarrel with them, pretending to chastise them for stealing the natives' corn. He whispered them to play along and suffer it, quote, be tolerant because of the evident danger in which we were, and that no one should put a hand on his weapons, end quote. He then, quote, thrashed some of them as he flattered the leader and told him that he did not wish the Christians should anger them, end quote. Evidently, the ruse worked, and the whole situation managed to be diffused. Eventually, Soto passed into the empire of the Cusco, the largest indigenous empire of the American South. And he would make it to the capital of said empire, but historians hotly debate exactly where that was. The most likely site is Cartier, Georgia, roughly between Chattanooga and Atlanta. One thing is certain, though. Upon arrival in said capital, the empire of the Cusco came out to meet Soto with great pomp and circumstance, only to have Soto immediately take the man captive. Soto then took what food he could, and then he, plus the emperor, who was a good hostage, continued south. On September the 16th, the army reached Tbilisi near Childersburg, Alabama, about 15 miles southeast of Birmingham. This was probably the last town under control of the Cusco Empire. Here Soto received several ambassadors from a nearby king named Tuscaloosa. Now, here's the thing. It's not Tuscaloosa. I know that's really confusing because there is a Tuscaloosa, Alabama, and it is really tempting to think that the two names are associated with each other, but they're not. Tuscaloosa was the king of the Attahachie, who were considered feared warriors. Soto would soon learn the veracity of that reputation. Here at this point, Soto also let the Cusco emperor, who he was still toting around, go back home, given that he was no longer of any use. It's really hard to document just how devastating Soto's march through Cusco territory was to the people there. What we can say is that when another expedition comes the same way, about 20 years later, they found a land essentially diminished to nothing. The population density that existed when Soto marched through had evaporated. Odds are that disease brought by Soto or possibly other European contacts wrought most of the devastation. By the 1670s, when the British started exploring the region, there was simply nothing left of any of these high Mississippian civilizations. And these, of course, were the true losers of Soto's expedition. As Soto headed south, King Tuscaloosa of the Attahachie weighed his options about what to do with these powerful, deadly strangers moving toward him, with the inevitability of a tornado gathering to vent its fury. But Tuscaloosa probably knew more in advance about the strangers than most of the Mississippian rulers, because he had already met a European. Actually, a Greek man had wandered through. His name was Doroteo Teodoro, which is fascinating because it's basically flipped. I've never seen a name like that before. Regardless, 13 years later, this Greek man had become a castaway on the coast of the south during the desperate voyage of Panfilo de Narvaez, the last failed effort to conquer La Florida. Later on, Cabeza de Vaca explained how he had disappeared, he being Tadeo, when Narvaez's fleet sent him to fetch water in the vicinity of what is today Mobile Bay. Nothing was known about his fate until the Indian showed Soto a small dagger that had belonged to this Greek man, who had apparently lived for a period of time in the Attahachie town of Piachi. Whether or not King Tuscaloosa actually met Teodoro is not known, but it seems likely that the king would have at least received a detailed report about this stranger and about the Spaniards that he came with. But this information would have been misleading to Tuscaloosa, because Narvaez's shabby fleet and emaciated army probably could not have provided anywhere close to an accurate example of what the Spanish could do in battle. Tuscaloosa may also have received sketchy reports about Narvaez's routing by the Apache in Florida, and over the past few weeks about Soto's largely peaceful march through Chiaja, all of which probably contributed to the course of action which was about to be taken with regard to these new visitors. There is evidence that the Attahachie dynasty of Tuscaloosa had only ruled for 2 or 3 generations. Still, there's no evidence whatsoever that Tuscaloosa's hold on power was anything but absolute. We know next to nothing about the city of Attahachie itself, other than had a plaza and 1 temple mound. What we do know is that while Tuscaloosa welcomed Soto upon his arrival to the city, the Indian king was already planning a devastating sneak attack on the newcomers. This suggests that Tuscaloosa's military understanding and abilities were, at the very least, significantly advanced. On October the 10th, Soto arrived in the capital of the Attahachie, which is also just called Attahachie. Here, Soto was greeted warmly, and that evening sat down with Tuscaloosa at a great banquet. Soto at this point probably thought that this would be nothing but another pleasant march through another Mississippian kingdom. When Soto demanded food, porters, and women, his usual refrain upon arrival in an indigenous kingdom, Tuscaloosa gave him several hundred porters, but rebuffed his other demands for the moment. Soto left the next day with his army, but as they marched away, Tuscaloosa was sending orders for his warriors to assemble at another one of his towns, Mabilla, further south. It took Soto 6 days of marching, but he ultimately reached Mabilla. There, several within Soto's camp warned him from entering the town, but Soto dismissed the warnings. He said he was tired of sleeping in a camp. He wanted to sleep inside the walled town, which was situated on a plain. We can't say today exactly where Mabilla was, only that given Soto's present speed, it should have been about where Selma, Alabama is today. When Soto arrived in Mabilla, he received the welcome that he was used to. He and his party soon found themselves having a good time, entertained by Indian dancers as the king, Tuscaloosa, and his nobles chatted amiably, and everyone feasted and drank fermented beverages and just generally had a good time. But one of the historians along with the expedition then explains what happened next, saying that Tuscaloosa went to a hut where his aides were holding a secret council of war. Quote, "When Tuscaloosa was among his captains and the chief men of his army, and he told them that they must come quickly, whether they would immediately cut the throats of the Spaniards who were there in the pueblo and of the others after them as they arrived, or whether they would wait until all of those had come, end quote. For a long time, the council argued over which option was best, until the king Tuscaloosa, rising to his full height, threw his weight behind killing at once any Spaniards who came within their power. He then issued the order to his troops hiding in the houses around the plaza to attack Soto and his party immediately. Eyewitnesses now report only that Tuscaloosa slipped away into a nearby house and then refused to come out when Soto asked him, telling Soto that, quote, he would not come out of there and he would not leave that town, end quote. Then, according to the same historian, Tuscaloosa issued a warning, quote, if Soto wished to go in peace, he should go immediately and should not insist on trying to take him out of his lands and dominion by force, end quote. At this point, according to the chroniclers, the Spaniards began looking around the town and realized that the houses were not empty as they had assumed, but filled with Indian soldiers armed for battle. Some of the members of Soto's guard, his personal guard, first noticed things were amiss when they saw natives hiding bundles of arrows and bows secretly in some palm leaves. This sent them rushing back to warn Soto, who must have frowned as he grabbed his helmet and strapped it on, while ordering the guard to fetch the horses as quickly as they could. At about this time, one of Soto's lieutenants was trying to get Tuscaloosa to come out of the hut. He grabbed a nearby noble and demanded to bring Tuscaloosa to him. When the man refused, he cut his arm off. The battle began moments later, when the Indians answered Soto's repeated demands for Tuscaloosa's return by suddenly bursting out of the houses and swarming into the streets in Plaza of Mabilla, shouting war cries and brandishing clubs, maces, and loaded bows. This was it. This was the moment for the expedition. According to one source, quote, immediately the Indians came out, charging towards Soto's position and leaping up to man the walls and towers guarding the city, end quote. Depending on what account you believe, Tuscaloosa had hidden 3,000, 5,000, or maybe even 11,000 warriors in huts, which he now threw against Hernando de Soto, his small aide and group of bodyguards. These men found themselves suddenly cut off from the city's gates and from the rest of the Spanish army, which remained sprawled out across several miles along the Alabama River. Soto and his party were fully armed, but they found themselves engaged in a situation very unfavorable to their style of fighting, which of course was cavalry-based. They were trapped in a cramped fortress town with their horses across the plaza, and masses of Mississippians surging toward them, eager to engage them using a close style of fighting that they excelled in. During the first few confusing minutes of the fight, 5 Spaniards of Soto's guard were struck down by arrows and a crush of well-aimed blows from maces. The others survived this initial wave of attackers, though some were wounded. Soto, too, was hit with some 20 arrows, though none penetrated his heavily quilted armor as he hacked back and forth with his sword. As the Spaniards fought to free themselves and escape out of the gate, 2 of them, Rodrigo Rangel and Juan Mendez de Solis, a member of Soto's guard, managed to fight their way to 2 of the horses tethered across the plaza. Solis was shot dead as he climbed into one of the saddles, but Rangel, as himself relates, managed to mount his horse and rear it up against the Atahachi. This caused the charging Indians to pause long enough for Soto to dash over to another mount and jump into the saddle. Soto could have then escaped the city through a nearby gate, but this was not his style. Instead, he turned abruptly back into the fray, blasting into the midst of the Indians to clear a path for bloodied bodyguards to follow him. This was what the conquistadors were famous for. This was their principal tactic, a sudden, aggressive thrust forward into the midst of unarmored Indians. Miraculously, Soto and most of the remaining guards escaped Mabilla alive, battling their way to the gate, where they ran out into the surrounding fields and raised the alarm among the soldiers then arriving at the outskirts of town. However, they were forced to leave behind a priest and some of Soto's servants, who were holed up to a house. They were all killed. As Soto and his party retreated in chaos, the Indians made a move that would later prove disastrous for the Spaniards. They invited the armor's porters to join them in the new bloody fight. Having stopped not far from Mabilla's walls, these Indians, some of them Atahachi warriors pressed into service just 2 days earlier, and others from as far away as Florida, responded eagerly to the defenders' request. They set down their loads, helped each other strike off their chains, and grabbed weapons from the stockpiles in the cities. In fact, they went through the army's own baggage, grabbing weapons, clothes, and everything from iron pots to leather shoes. Shortly thereafter, the Indians, quote, closed the gates of the town and began to beat their drums, to raise banners with a great yell, and open the trunks and bundles to display on top of the wall all that the Spaniards had brought, end quote. Out in the field, the Spaniards were in disarray, as Soto, probably looking like a porcupine with arrows sticking out from his armor, galloped hard to the nearest soldiers, shouting them furiously to get ready to defend themselves. The governor then organized a troop to encircle the town to prevent any Indians from escaping, taking an additional 60 or 80 men to form into 4 squadrons so that he could assault the town on 4 sides as well. This was Soto at his finest. This was Soto at his worst also. And this is pure conquistador. Surrounded with innumerable odds, where the intelligent thing to do for any military commander would be strategic retreat or withdrawal, what is Soto going to do? He's going to do what the conquistador would do. He's going to charge right back into the numbers. According to one historian, the signal for the Spanish counterassault was the blast of an arquebus, which boomed over the Alabama plains as the 4 squadrons threw themselves against the palisaded town. The Indians repelled this onslaught, with the Spaniards pulling back in exhaustion, most of them so tired from the unexpected combat after weeks of comparative inactivity that they paused for a moment to assuage their thirst from a nearby pond. They only stopped when they realized that the pond was already soaked in blood from the earlier parts of the combat. After this brief pause, the Spaniards attacked again and again, and this give and take of Spanish attacks and Indian parries continued throughout the afternoon. According to one eyewitness, the Indians, quote, fought with so much spirit that they drove us, the Spaniards, outside again and again, end quote. Another witness adds that at one point the Indians even tried an offensive thrust outside their walls, rushing out as the Spaniards appeared to be falling back. But this was only a ruse by Soto to try to draw them out, which failed when the defenders quickly retreated back behind their walls. It was during this action that another witness reports one of the army's favorite captains was killed, one of Soto's in-laws, Don Carlos Enriquez. He had stopped to pull an arrow out of his horse in front of the city wall, only to be struck by another in the neck between his armor's collar and the bottom of his helmet. According to one witness, quote, asking for confession, he fell dead, end quote. The battle continued well into the autumn afternoon. Though as more and more Spanish troops heard the alarm and rushed forward as reinforcements, it soon became clear that once more European arms and armaments would prevail. Repeatedly, they threw themselves against the walls, hacking with swords and axes against the plaster, cane, and branches. Each time they were beaten back, only to return to hack away at more of it. Finally, as the afternoon waned, they breached the wall enough for a few men to rush inside and set the nearest houses on fire. Instantly, the flames caught on the cane thatch roof as a deadly wall of fire exploded across the city. And in a flash, heat and smoke shattered the Indians' defense. Hundreds of Attatachi were trapped and obliterated by the flames within minutes. The rest ran for their lives, either into the central plaza or over the walls into the fields outside. Either option brought the warriors face to face with Spanish swords, as Soto's cavalry stood ready to cut them down in what devolved into a massacre like the slaughter at Cajamarca, when Soto and his outriders spent the night of Atahualpa's capture killing Inca. But unlike the Peruvians, the Attatachi had fought on until the cause became so hopeless that a great number of them committed suicide by fleeing, quote, into the burning houses, where piled up on top of one another, they were suffocated and burned to death, end quote. This battle, one of the bloodiest fought in 5 centuries of warfare between Europeans and Indians on what would become United States soil, ended at sunset with Mabilla in flames and heaps of Indians lying dead or dying as men moaned and coughed and blood soaked the ground. One of the last Indians died as twilight came and the first cool breeze of night blew over the battlefield. It happened as a group of Spaniards, themselves wounded and exhausted and drenched in blood and sweat, chanced to look up on what remained of Mabilla's smoldering ramparts. There, they saw an Indian warrior wake up after lying unconscious for most of the battle, reviving just as a line of fire was closing in on him, threatening to burn him alive. The men desperately tried to escape the flames by running up a bastion, only to look out onto the plain, where he saw heaps of dead Indians and units of Spanish cavalry chasing down those still alive and running them through with lances. Overwhelmed by despair and what he probably knew was the end of his people and their civilization, this unnamed Mississippian quickly unstrung his bowstring, and before the Spaniards watching him could scramble up the wall to stop him, threw it over the branch of a nearby tree, wrapped it around his neck, and hung himself. We have no idea how many Native Americans died at Mabilla, but the next time that a European gets to southern Alabama 19 years later, the only trace of Tuscaloosa's kingdom was a few survivors amongst the ruins of Attahachie. All that night, Soto writhed in pain from the injuries he sustained in the battle, a reminder both of the battle's ferocity and of his own foolishness for getting himself ensnared in the ambush in the first place. He was, of course, lucky. 18 to 25 Spaniards died, one of the worst battles for European in the New World up to that point. But the most devastating loss was the complete destruction of the army's baggage train, which had burned to the ground in the midst of the fire. Soto now desperately needed to get back to his ships. Now, interestingly, our chroniclers offer differing accounts about whether or not the army even found the ships. One claims that Soto did hear about them from Indians on the coast, who sent word to his translator, Juan Ortiz, that the Spanish vessels were at anchor 6 days' march to the south. This chronicler insists, though, that Soto did not contact the fleet, worried that his men might desert him and return to Cuba. Accordingly, the governor arranged that the translator should be quiet about it and make sure that none of the items of value make their way to the ships. Now, there's another story here, though. There's a different chronicler that tells us that Soto did mention the existence of the ships to his men, but refused to let anyone make contact with them. This historian gives us a reason that has nothing to do with fear of desertion. He says Soto vetoed the request because the army was low on provisions. This man writes, quote, "Many wish that the governor would go to sea, because they, the Indians, gave us news of the brigantines, but he did not dare to go to the ships because the month of November was already half over and it was very cold, and he felt it advisable to look for a land where he might find provisions in order to be able to winter," end quote. But this seems like an odd reason. Even if there was a scarcity of food in southern Alabama, it seems incredible that Soto would move off his current position without contacting the captain of the fleet or offloading desperately needed supplies that might help alleviate the lack of provisions. Nor does it seem likely that if the army knew about the ships, someone didn't slip away to try to find them, beg passage to Cuba, something that the commander of the fleet is adamant later on did not happen. And curiously, a third of our contemporary historians, the ones who are writing as Soto's traveling, he doesn't mention the ships at all, which is a perplexing omission given that this man was Soto's secretary, and he would have been far more likely to know about the ships than anyone else. I suspect the real reason that Hernando de Soto turned away from the ships was because he continued to believe in the dream of an El Dorado. He continued to believe in his ultimate success. The thing that I think perplexes most historians is, why did Soto's men continue to follow him after the disaster at Mabilla? Only one historian suggests that there was any true dissension in the army, and he recounts a story about a half-baked mutiny led by the royal treasurer. In a story that rings about as true as any in the narrative that he wrote, the same man was in Peru. He describes Hernando de Soto after Mabilla as facing an army, quote, frightened and disturbed by the incredible ferocity of the battle, end quote, with a sizable number of men now wishing to, quote, leave the land and go away from it as soon as they could. A few of these grumblers conspired to desert to the sea to look for whatever ships they could find. However, before they could leave, their plan was leaked to the governor, De Soto, quote. This man says that De Soto actually disguised himself, this is kind of crazy, to investigate the allegations personally. So I guess Hernando de Soto shaved really quickly or put on a fake beard or something and pretended to be, just some common Joe walking around. What do you guys think of the captain? Oh, mutiny? We should probably kill that guy. I just can't imagine that. That just seems like something out of a really, really bad comedy reduction of this entire investigation. But according to one historian, it absolutely happened. And it turns out that he found out that his men did want to leave. And this man wrote, quote, this hurt the governor exceedingly, for he understood from these words that his army was disintegrating, and that his men, in finding a place to go, would all desert him, end quote. So it's kind of interesting that the iron-willed De Soto at the very end of his life, because we are getting close to the end of it here, winds up just feeling personally really upset by the things that his men are saying. Not that this might imperil the expedition from a strategic perspective, but he almost seems to believe at this point that the only thing that he has going is this personal charisma and belief that everything's going to be okay. And when that starts to get rattled, for the first time, he starts to maybe wonder about the wisdom of all of this. If only he would have gone to the ships. But by mid-November, winter was fast approaching. The army finally began to limp along inland in search of food to pillage. They crossed the Alabama River near Selma and continued northwest. Desperate for food, Soto's army now effectively lurches from village to village like locusts, eating anything and everything available. By early December, the rain and snow had now begun and matters were getting desperate. Soto managed to find another native civilization, this time called the Chickasaw, not Chickasaw, Chickasaw, with whom the army stayed through the winter as very much uninvited guests. Soto remained there until early March when the snows cleared. Once the Spanish were on the move, the Chickasaw had their revenge, however. Like Tuscaloosa, Chickasaw planned a nighttime sneak attack. Their warriors trailed Soto's army until one night they set the roofs of the houses the Spaniards were staying in on fire. When the Spaniards ran out, the warriors attacked. Fortunately for Soto, the Chickasaw were so successful in their initial attack that the horses got loose, and this so spooked the natives that they abruptly broke off their attack. Had they not, Soto almost certainly would have perished that very night. As it were, any baggage Tuscaloosa had not destroyed was now lost forever. Soto responded with immediate action. He moved his men 3 miles away and prepared for another attack. It never came. But the men were now absolutely miserable from lack of food and the bitter cold. After a week, the Chickasaw finally attacked again. But Soto was ready, and the attack was easily repulsed. And so, the army kept moving. Finally, on May 8, 1541, the army came out of the wilderness and stood atop a low bluff. Below them stretched the mighty Mississippi River. Interestingly, those Europeans who first gazed down upon the river had no idea of its importance. They only marveled at the river's size. I do want to say, by the way, there are a lot of conflicting claims now by different historians as to who saw the Mississippi River first in terms of Europeans. For a long time, Hernando de Soto was credited as being the first European to, quote unquote, discover the Mississippi River, but I do want to point out now, those claims have subsequently been hotly disputed. I'm not sure that we have a final conclusion yet. The men who were with Soto were happier, frankly, to see a town down the river about 30 miles to the south of Memphis with ripening fields of corn. The corn they could eat. The Mississippi, while pretty, they couldn't. For nearly a month, Soto's half-starved army rested under shade trees along the Mississippi. They ate local corn and roasted a huge aquatic beast the Spaniards called a bagre, but which we now know today is a catfish. Soto's engineers worked to construct 4 flat-bottom rafts to take the army across the river. The engineers finished the rafts on June the 17th and crossed the river that very night. Soto had now reached the final state in what would be the United States that he would ever see, Arkansas. His goal right now remained the same: find an indigenous community he could leech off of and buy more time for his army to recover. Soto moved north after crossing the river, staying in Pachaca, the home of yet another Native American band. He stayed there for about a month, all the while continuing to reconnoiter the area, looking for gold, never giving up on his dream. He left there in late July and turned south. His army was now no longer able to move great distances without regular stopping, and this time traveling perhaps 50 miles in around 21 days. It's hard to see what Soto's purpose is at this point, other than simply to keep moving forward. If you look at a map right now, he's basically zigzagging between the Mississippi River and the Arkansas River, moving from river to river, stream to stream, really with no discernible goal or object. And so it was on September the 14th, he reached the Arkansas River proper. On September the 14th, a Wednesday, the party came to a quote-unquote large river, the Arkansas, which one of the men said flowed into the Mississippi. By now, the weight of Soto's gathering failure must have been bearing down on him. Indeed, the bitter realization that he was not going to be successful must have confronted him every time he looked in the starving faces of his men or watched the unsteady gait of the lean horses, scarred by battle wounds and bites from swarms of insects, and ridiculously armored now in dried hides of buffalo. But the 41-year-old kept going. In mid-September, they reached the tilled fields and small villages of the Chaos, most likely arriving at the Arkansas River about 30 miles north of Little Rock. He entered this verdant valley where the river flows slightly, flanked on the north and south by tree-clad mountains and hills that fade into the distant, hazy expanse of purple and green. Soto continued to press on down the valley, sending out parties scouting as far west now as Oklahoma, a few miles from what is Fort Smith, Arkansas. There, the Spaniards found themselves entering a brand new topography of anything they had seen before. What looked like a sea of grass, where the soil was chalkier, less rich, the land was flat, and there seemed to be so little water that no trees could grow. Obviously, it was a place unsuited for any sort of large-scale Indian kingdoms or empires, and nor was there any evidence of any ocean anywhere nearby. Faced with the reality of dead ends to the west and north, even Soto had to admit that this expedition had finally reached the end of the line. But he was still not ready to give up, having one final card to play. Nearby were the Ocoachi Mountains, a steep, rocky range that no doubt reminded Soto of his time in Nicaragua, Honduras, and then also in Peru. In these places, the Spaniards had found traces of gold in streams and in shallow, narrow veins. Praying that these mountains, too, contained gold nuggets, he ordered his men on the 18th of October to go into the Ocoachi foothills, where he wandered about for the next 5 days. They sifted through the silt of creeks and rivers, but every single time, the men came up empty. On October 23rd, he reluctantly left the mountains. The army marched quickly back to Arkansas, now not interested in gold, but only finding a well-provisioned town within which to pass the winter, the Army's third in North America. Soto had now finally made a decision, the decision he should have made a long time ago. He planned to go back to the Mississippi River, establish a base where it met the ocean, and then return to Cuba to prepare another expedition. Great idea, Too bad it was just about 3 years too late. Ironically, at almost the exact same time, the expedition which had left Mexico under Francisco de Coronado was in central Kansas and itself on the verge of giving up. Hence, the two failed quests for gold were only 700 miles apart, even though there's no evidence either knew of the presence of the other. Near Redfield, Arkansas, about 20 miles south of Little Rock, Soto and his men spent another terrible winter. During this winter, Soto lost his translator, who died of illness. If you looked around at the faces of his men at this point, I'm sure one thing would be clear. No one expected to get out alive. Not anymore. On March the 6th, 1542, the snows ended, and Soto began the march toward the Mississippi. He was now desperate to get back to the Gulf of Mexico, find his ships, and make it back to Spain. Sadly, he had no idea how far he truly was from the Gulf. By mid-April, he reached present-day Arkansas City, which he thought was close to the Gulf, but which is in reality 175 miles north of the Gulf of Mexico. The locals told Soto such, but by now he was far too delusional to believe them. By late April, Soto was racked by fever. By mid-May, it was clear he was going to die. In mid-May 1542, Soto's fever was racking his 42-year-old frame, turning him gaunt and pale. What he felt as he slipped farther into delusions of fever, we don't know. Gathering his close friends together, he told them, quote, he was about to give them an accounting before the throne of God of all his past life, end quote. Though the witness tells us he didn't seem particularly concerned about this. Indeed, he was dying the way he had lived, worshipping his warrior god, and undoubtedly feeling as though he had served Spain and the god well, who of course was Spanish. He thanked his remaining soldiers for remaining loyal despite all their hardships. He asked them to forgive any offense they might have received from them. His men, in turn, begged him to choose a successor. Soto named his old comrade from Peru, Luis de Mosoco, probably because he knew his old friend was a savvy leader and anxious to get out. Slowly and quietly, Hernando de Soto receded deeper into fever. Then, on May the 21st, 1542, he died. Luis de Mosoco and a small band of Soto's friends disinterred him and carried his body to one of the army's dugouts at the river's edge. They loaded the already rotting corpse of the governor of La Florida into a large hollow log and carried it out to the middle of the river. There, in really what was an almost impossibly poetic finale to this guy's life, his friends heaved the log containing his body into the swirling, writhing rivers of the Mississippi, where it quickly sank beneath the surface, plunging him to the depths of the river Hernando de Soto supposedly discovered. It took more than a year for Luis de Mosoco to lead the remnant of Soto army out of La Florida and to return 311 of them safely to Mexico. He tried to march overland 1,000 miles across Arkansas and Texas, but turned back near modern-day Dallas, where the country was too dry and sparsely populated to feed and maintain his army. In September 1492, they arrived back at the Mississippi where Soto had died. Here, they spent another winter in a nearby city before building boats to float down the Mississippi. Harassed by floods and fierce attack by Native Americans, Mosoco and his exhausted troop finally made it to the Gulf. They then sailed to Mexico, astonishing the neighbors of a town called Panuco by arriving on September the 10th, 1543, after having been long ago given up for dead. Hernando de Soto, in a lot of ways, closes the book on the age of the conquistador. There will be other small expeditions, but his is really the last Spanish throw of the dice in an effort to find another indigenous empire, another city of gold somewhere in the Americas. By the middle of the 16th century, enough of the Americas have been explored that Europeans have finally, perhaps quietly, perhaps reticently, accepted the fact that there just simply were no more kingdoms of Mexica. There were no more kingdoms of Inca worth conquering. From the middle to the late 16th century on, the attitude towards the New World is going to shift as we see less conquistadors and more intrepid settlers who are trying to use the land to produce luxury cash crops like tobacco and especially sugarcane that they can sell, realizing that the gold itself was tapped out. I also think Hernando de Soto is a cautionary tale from the age. I don't fault him at first for what he was doing, although to us, of course, conquistadors are horrifyingly brutal in their attitudes towards the First Nations of the Americas. But that being said, you have to remember Hernan Cortez had discovered a wealthy indigenous empire. Francisco Pizarro, whom Hernando de Soto worked with, also discovered one. There's no indication whatsoever, given the size of the Americas, that they should have been tapped out of wealthy kingdoms that Spaniards like de Soto could have simply leached off of, which is what his goal ultimately was. De Soto just didn't realize that there were no more empires. And at the end of the day, he didn't understand that the way that Europeans needed to approach the Americas had to change. Time and time again, even his own men fault him for not building a settlement. He had tons of opportunities, and the history of the Americas, especially if we think about Georgia and the Carolinas, might have been very different. If there's a thriving Spanish colony by the 17th century around what is Charleston, that may very well check British advances in the region. Of course, there's no way of knowing, but it's an interesting historical what if. Regardless, De Soto was working on the old model, which was find, conquer, take. Problem was there was no one to conquer. There was nothing to take. He just didn't know that yet. All right, well, today's episode was a lot of content, but if you still need more, check out the website at westerncivpodcast.com. Also, you can now do a free 7-day trial of my Patreon service. So if you check out the link in the show notes, patreon.com/Western Civ Podcast, instead of paying the $1 or $2 or $5 a month, whatever you would like, you can give it a try and see if you like some of the additional content that's there. Again, for $12 a year, you get no ads, and that's super helpful to me too, because it helps purchase the books that keep it all going. So if you want to check that out, feel free. There's also still a 7-day free trial of Western Civ 2.0. That link is in the show notes as well. Now, next time we are switching gears. We are actually, for the first time in months, going to move away from the Americas. We're going to go back to Europe. And I want to now spend the next couple of weeks talking about something that's been growing since the Age of Discovery got kicked off. And that is the scientific revolution, the early scientific revolution. So we're talking about math, astronomy, Copernicus, Galileo, Tycho Brahe, all of these people who changed the way dramatically that humankind sees the world, especially from a European perspective. And don't worry, we're also going to talk about the reaction to that, because for every Galileo, there's an Inquisition. And it's important to understand the yin and the yang.